Is this working? Perfect, you all hear me? Yeah, I would love to get the panelists here, I suppose, because this is not about me. I'm Niels van Pamel from Child Focus. The topic of today, of this panel, is tackling online GBV through integrated policies. And yeah, let's zoom in to these like fancy words. What are integrated policies? How can we get them into this conversation? Integrated policies, for me, it means like zooming in before you zoom out, and zooming out before you zoom in to a certain topic, and look at it from a 360-degree angle, right? So therefore, we brought together this very complementary panel. 4 powerhouses, so high that you get like claustrophobic when you're walking on the streets. First of all, we have Asha Allen, Program Director for Online Expression and Civic Space for the Center of Democracy and Technology. We have Elena Pavan, Associate Professor of Sociology at the Department of Sociology and Social Research at the University of Trento. Then we have Eleonora Esposito, researcher at the Institute for Culture and Society of the University of Navarra in Spain. And last but not least, Julie Guichard, EU Government Affairs Manager at Microsoft. Of course, I will not mansplain, so my first question is very easy. Could you please introduce yourselves and why you are here? What is the link between what you do and this panel? Let's start with Asha, please. Hi.
Is this on? Oh, it is on. Hi, good morning, everyone. So yes, thank you for the introduction.
We'll sit here now, I realize.
Thank you to our hosts for organizing this event. My name is Asha Allen. I am the Program Director for Online Expression and Civic Space at CDT Europe, but also the Deputy Director of the office. I've been working on online gender-based violence now since 2016, so it might be one of the reasons I'm here to talk about this particular issue. So my primary role is to conduct advocacy, lead the advocacy of the organization on issues related to online expression, and look at that through an intersectional lens. And by intersectional lens, I did actually have a question before, but I wanted to wait until we got to the panel. I used the intersectional methodology as prescribed by Kimberly Crenshaw, the Black female academic who coined the term and wrote the paper on this, and using that methodology to apply it to platform governance and content governance regulation that we have a lot of now here in the EU. So it's a small job, but I enjoy it.
Hi, everyone. I am Elena from the University of Trento. I'm here because I was kindly invited and trusted to be here. And so what is my expertise in the study of social movements and political participation? I study the conditions in which feminist, trans-feminist, and LGBTQAI+ movements emerge, thrive, and are challenged. And but beside that, I also study what they produce in terms of knowledge, so the type of experiences they embody and the reasons why they actually exist as a means to move collectively towards a more inclusive and fair status quo. And following back to what was just said, I do it with an intersectional perspective, which is not the very academic elaboration of intersectionality, but how it is actually contextualized in practices within these collective experiences. And so today I'm going to share with you a couple of thoughts about all of this. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Yes, I am Eleonora Esposito, and I'm a researcher at the University of Navarra in the Institute for Culture and Society. And since last June, I'm also a seconded national expert at the European Commission at DigiConnect. I'm in the team enforcing the Digital Services Act, and I am in charge of the managing and coordinating the efforts for the enforcement on the pornographic platforms, and also focusing on everything gender-based violence and gender-based violence as a systemic risk acknowledged in the DSA. Before joining the Commission, I was at IGE, the European Institute for Gender Equality in Vilnius, when I was managing the project on cyber violence against women and girls, and we came out with a report in 2022. Before that, I was a Marie Curie Fellow with a project on violence against women in politics online. So, yeah, more or less, this is where I move myself, you know, in triangulating power and gender and the digital. So, yeah. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Julie from Microsoft. Thank you all for joining us in our lovely offices today. I work in the EU Government Affairs team, so you heard from Nana Louise, her team. We work on influencing, analyzing, and then implementing EU regulation and legislation. And I work mostly on everything that touches digital safety. So that includes youth safety as well as gender safety, and let's see what else comes in the next term.
All right, thank you. Let's get this started with Asha. The question I thought about for you is like, first of all, how important is it to differentiate at all between the online and the offline worlds when talking about GBV? But also, like, how would you say this that's a hard word for me, legislative shift in the EU aimed at addressing gender-based violence online, how it influenced like policy frameworks and societal attitudes towards online safety and gender equality?
Sure, absolutely. So I think it's important to delineate between online and offline gender-based violence, but it's also important to contextualize it within the continuum of gender-based violence that we exist in. Mm-hmm. So of course, online gender-based violence has specific manifestations that we have to recognize that have been exacerbated over the years. So we're looking at the non-consensual sharing of images and looking at issues like doxing and the creation of deepfakes, for example. But you also can't negate the fact that tech facilitates existing forms of gender-based violence. So if you talk to frontline service providers, for example, in domestic violence shelters, they will tell you the significant increase in the use of GPS tracking technologies that have not only put them in danger, but it increases the level of stalking, which then moves to cyber stalking, that victims may experience. The same thing when you think about domestic violence situations or intimate partner violence, the level of ease in which financial and psychological coercive control has increased through the use of tech-facilitated violence. So it's important to do that, but to contextualize it, as I said, within the context that we are in. And so when I say contextualize, it's not just looking at the different forms, but it's also applying a gender lens to certain forms of online harms that we need to recognize where there's an additional gender dimension. So one thing I would raise is gender disinformation, which I think is a great example of what we're looking at. That's something that crosses those intersections. There's been a lot of emphasis on disinformation, its disruption to our democratic processes. But when you look at gender disinformation and the specific sexist and misogynistic lens that it takes towards politically engaged women, for example, or just people who want to engage in a democratic or civic debate online, you understand that we're still living very clearly in a patriarchy and a misogynistic world. And one of the questions I wanted to relate to earlier was looking at the intersection, not only in terms of young and age, but also to look at it, looking at the continuation of racism. Because if you are a black woman, the percentage of you, the likelihood of you experiencing online gender-based violence goes up by 84%. They are the most targeted group in the online space when it comes to online gender-based violence. And so when you look at gender disinformation as an example, my amazing colleagues in the US conducted a report last year, won an award recently, so I have to mention it for them, looking at the experience of women and colour politicians in the US elections, and it was extremely clear the level of racist and sexist speech that they were experiencing and the level of violence they experienced, and that takes a psychological toll and it has, real implications. So that's to say, yes, we should delineate so that we could recognise the different forms, but we have to recognise, and this is important when it comes to education, we still live in a patriarchal, racist, misogynistic world. that's the reality of what we live in.
Yes.
And so unless we address the societal structures in which we continue to live in, then it will continue to manifest both online and offline. So to come to your second question on this legislative shift, what I've seen since being here in Brussels since 2016, since a small thing happened in my home country of the UK, and I left to come here, there's been an increased recognition of online gender-based violence. And I would say in 2017, we were looking at discussions about cyber harassment, cyberbullying. It was very much contextualized in the context of the experience of young people who may be more engaged in the online space. And there were really important reports from IGA that were really looking into this and adding that gender lens to kind of online harms. And they were really seminal reports. But you could also see what happened in the 2019 elections. There were women politicians who directly experienced online gender-based violence who then came into the European legislative sphere with the political will to do something about it and to really continue to push. But we also saw shifts at the international level. There was a lot more pressure on big tech companies to abide by their obligations and their responsibilities under the international human rights framework to ensure that their products and services do not violate our rights, and to look at it from a gender lens. So if you look to the Committee on the Status of Women, so CSW 65, which was organized by UN, there was a specific emphasis on online gender-based violence and how tech-facilitated violence continues to perpetuate gender inequity. And so these increasing acknowledgements led to really important developments, and that was the recognition of gender-based violence as a systemic risk in the Digital Services Act, which was not there in the original draft. It was added. There were a lot of pressure and a lot of work from a lot of great advocates to ensure that it was recognized in there. And similarly, looking at the directive, which we've just had agreed a couple of weeks ago. And it's important to note that out of the things that have been criminalized, 60% of them is cyber violence. Yeah. That can be coming down. We'll get into why that's the case and legal basis and all of these things, and we can get into that. But these shifts have meant that there's clearly now a legal framework that we can refer to. We've gone from what I would say in the last 9 or 10 years to this is an online issue and there just needs to be more education about not getting you to share your images with other people and things, to going, no, this is a manifestation of gender inequality and we need to do something about it concretely.
Yes. All right, thank you so much. Yeah, I think it's very important indeed, like that we have to recognize the current fact that we still live, as you said, in a sexist, racist, and misogynist world, and start from there. Things have changed, but like taking it back to, for example, my own work at the Belgian Safer Internet Center, we notice that indeed, in this online sphere, we are noticing a hyperbolic increase in cases on like doxing, exposing online. Of course, 95% of the victims there are women. And what do we see? People move these kinds of behaviors towards platforms that are not responsive, for example, to name one, Telegram. So it's very good that we also take the time to talk to industry about this. And you see me coming, hi Julie. Could you, as coming from a company who of course brings the good example to the table, could you provide some insights on ensuring content security and preventing the spread of harmful material, perhaps through the implementation of safety by design strategies?
Sure, and thanks for saying we're a good player. We try really hard, and it's something we take extremely seriously. So I think what's important to note when you look at the industry perspective is that, first of all, not all services are built equally, all right? So the difference between a good player and a bad player can be enormous. The difference between a publicly disseminated service like social media or gaming, for example, are going to have wildly different risk profiles than a service like interpersonal communications. So I think what's good to note is that a lot of these risks that come back, especially gendered risks, are generally speaking the same. They're very often the same themes as we saw in Manabel's wonderful research, but they will have different manifestations according to the risk profile and the risk service. And so I think the conclusion that the report had on not building, the same solutions to a vastly different problem is something that we need to keep in mind. I think what's also important to note is that depending on the service you are at, you will have different reporting. So if we look at ICS services, interpersonal communication services, we know that the underreporting is absolutely enormous. So only 1 in 4 of women violently targeted on ICS services will underreport, or won't report, excuse me. And that means that getting real data is extremely difficult, and then tailoring your solutions to that is even more so difficult. Which is why at Microsoft annually on Safer Internet Day, we actually publish the consumer research that we do annually. And perhaps to include some ever so slight good news, we found this year that of all the respondents we interviewed, where in 2022, 69% had reported having experienced an online risk in the year, we were dropped this year to 65%. So an ever so slight decrease, but showing that there is, a desire to take action. What we do in that research also systematically is group the data both gendered in different gender groups, as well as different age groups, separating both girls and boys, as well as teen girls and teen boys, because the risk profiles are also going to be vastly different. And what we found this year that I think is incredibly telling to this conversation is that of all the risks that boys and girls will experience, whether that be personal, sexual, other risks, girls will experience those risks on a higher profile systematically. So we do know that the data does support that this disproportionately impacts girls as well as gendered groups. Mm-hmm. So how do we tackle that? And is, safety by design the save-all, end-all? I think what's really key, what we try to do at Microsoft, is to adjust our responses in a way that doesn't exclude or doesn't remove the victim from the online experience that we know can also be extremely powerful. It can be a way in which women and girls meet their communication needs, and meets their sharing needs, their educational needs as well. So how do we tackle this without telling women and girls, well, don't go online if you don't want to get harassed? And we do that through 4 pillars, the first of which is what we call platform architecture. So that's really about implementing your safety teams at the very onset of product and service design. So we want to make sure that safety experts, including yourselves here in this room, are integrated from the get-go in these conversations to prevent harms from happening in the first place. And again, these will look different based on what service you have. So if you're going to be targeted especially by children, then it makes sense to have something like age assurance, perhaps, or parental tools. But that won't necessarily be the same for a service not really targeted for children. The second facet is content moderation, and here the role is really for our safety teams to make sure that our rules are clear, consistent, transparent, and there the DSA will, I think, do wonders in terms of making that harmonized throughout Europe. And the third one is all about culture. So I think we see online really interesting subcultures that create themselves on different platforms, different services, and it's really our job to make sure that when those subcultures form, they form with respect at the core, with dignity at the core, and that really we try, and educational was mentioned so many times already today, which I think is fantastic, is that we take educational practices and we really integrate them into cultures of services. And the last one obviously is collaboration. So we can't do it alone. We shouldn't do it alone. We don't have the expertise to do it all the way alone. And I think there the DSA will also serve as an excellent tool to integrate civil society, industry, victims into coming up with solutions in a smart way, in a privacy-conscious way, and in a consistent way across Europe.
All right, thank you. That's very interesting. Maybe by a show of hands, should we explain how the DSA is relevant here? Does everybody know what the DSA is, what it stands for? If not, please raise your hand and don't be scared to do so. All right. Maybe as a very short follow-up question, because we will talk about the DSA later for sure. Could you maybe say very briefly how this impacts already on your sides, on industry sides, with the good and the bad players? Like, how will this change the fields and in the context of online safety?
Sure. You guys have another 45 minutes or something?
Yeah.
I think the DSA we can break down into three main facets that I think are really going to take the field forward. The first one, again, is content moderation. So it'll implement new content moderation rules in a harmonized, systematic way across Europe. And it's a regulation, it's not a directive. So everyone, all member states will have to be compliant straight away, as opposed to coming up with their own implementing acts. So as part of the content moderation, we'll get risk assessment, risk mitigation measures, as well as a new legal framework kind of around trusted flaggers, which is the first time we see this institutionalization of researchers getting, or trusted flaggers, specialized NGOs getting a say. The second facet, I think, is it'll generate a lot more transparency. So it'll make mandatory for big players as well as smaller players in the scope of the DSA to publish comprehensible reports every year, as well as Article 40 will also provide vetted researcher access into the company in order to perform better research on systemic risk. And then the last one is it'll, I think, generate more accountability in the sense that, for example, we'll have very large online platforms and very large online search engines will be subject to auditing on an annual basis, as well as the mandatory obligation to publish all of the reporting that's done on their services and then how that is handled. Mm-hmm. So I'll stop here.
Yeah, as a hopefully future trusted flagger organization, we are super happy that this is happening right now. This brings me to Elena Nora. As a national expert to DG Connect, you contribute to the enforcement of this DSA. And also having studied a digitalized society in various contexts, how do you look at the digital future of Europe in regard to these complex intersections between language and gender?
Wow, the digital future. Well, the digital future is very much unwritten, I think. Probably this is a good thing, but we can already see or foresee where it's going, right? We're talking about the AI as an increasing aspect of the internet. We're talking about the concept of the metaverse, right? And the interaction between AI and the metaverse. And these are some of the hot topics, the challenges, they're already all over the press. And I like to believe that we approach these challenges with a new maturity compared to the Web 1.0 and the Web 2.0 revolutions, and a new awareness of the problems that are at stake, the potential pitfalls. I think we know by now that the internet is intersectional. And the intersectional internet is not mine, I wish it was, but it's a title of a 2016 book by Sofia Umoja-Noble and Brendesha Tynes. And it's a very interesting collection, because they already in 2016 were talking about the cybersphere conceptualizing as not being a neutral space, but as the fact that your lived experience as a user of the internet can really vary according to your identity, to your gender, to your sexual orientation, to your race, to your ethnicity, to your mother tongue. Think about how much of the internet is in English, whether you have a disability, among other aspects. So, right, online problems, and I think that this is an idea that has really been emerging today, this morning, do exist as they replicate, in part at least, they extend the power relations of the world that we live by. And this all pre-exists digital communication, right? And we should be really careful not to trivialize them as internet phenomena. And it's not just about gender-based violence, which is a buzzword of today. I think that the panorama is kind of more complex. First of all, we could talk about gendered language in our digital communication, for example. Gendered language is a topic of concern. The way in which, by the use of language, we kind of continue and we sustain inequality. Representation in digital media, and most importantly, underrepresentation of women in fields like tech, video games, other online platforms, and also the representation in digital media as the portrayal of unrealistic beauty standards that contribute to reinforcing gender norms and expectations. Of course, algorithms and bias. Algorithms used to perpetuate gender bias. Now we have the AI Act. The AI Act talks about discrimination in a very general way, at least as far as I'm concerned, for the latest version of the text that I have read. And I think it would be important as we implement it to define what we need by bias and discrimination in AI, and what are the multifaceted forms that this concept can actually take online, and it is so important to address this and to make women and girls part of the development of these tools if we want for these tools to speak to them and of them and about them and for them. Of course, gender-based violence and online harassment, we've talked about this a lot, but also I think that there is also a part that we need to protect, like online communities and the role that they have for activism and for, as a place to explore and express gendered identities, supportive spaces for individuals to connect with others that share similar experiences, fostering a sense of belonging, digital activism and empowerment, raising awareness about gendered issues, sharing diverse perspectives, mobilizing support. We would not have had Me Too, right, without the internet. And this has gained momentum, and I think it has shown the internet for the good and what it can do. Of course, this is somehow also part of the, the aims of the DSA, right? And which is a global first in this sense, in the field of protection of the digital space against the spread of the whole set of illegal and harmful content. But I think it's about protecting safety of the users, and it's about somehow extending the value of fundamental rights to the digital world, and everything that applies to the physical world now applies also to the digital. I don't really like the online-offline divide. I try to say digital and physical. It sounds also a little bit more refined in a way, but no, really, because I really think that this somehow embodies this continuum, right? And so this is, I think, the heart of the DSA, engaging in this proactive action, breaking this divide, and it's kind of, the equivalent of putting fire extinguishers and emergency exits in this room, right? We need to make sure that everybody has access to support and safety from wherever they access the internet in the EU, and that is something that can be taken for granted.
100% agree. This kind of representation that we need, brings me maybe to Elena, because this integrated policies, they need inclusive strategies, right? So as a sociologist, you study both the field of feminist and LGBTQIA+ mobilizations. How are participation, inclusion, mobilization, and social movement things to strive for within integrated policies? How can we include grassroots voices, for example? That's another question.
Thank you for the question. It's a very difficult question. But if you don't mind, I would like to begin by clarifying what we talk when we talk about social movements. Because it's a label that lately, and I would say especially in connection with the widespread use of social media, and especially after the so-called Arab Springs in 2011, has been used over and over again. But as a scholar, and as an activist myself, I'm afraid that sometimes we don't really know what we mean when we talk about social movements. And so social movements are immense and widespread articulation of everyday experiences of injustice that do put all the energies that they have in trying to overcome those injustices and actually anticipating a future of justice. And of course, we're talking about progressive social movements here. We're not talking, well, there are social movements also that are conservative and highly regressive, but we're not discussing about that here today. So social movements are projects, collective projects of change. And these things do not exist just out of the blue. They are a commitment and a labor of coordination, and they also are an activity of constant knowledge production. The fields that we study in universities and in colleges, disability studies, racism, sociology of racism, gender studies, they come from social movements. They are what it's left, and inside what has been brought, sorry, better to say that way, what it's brought from the grassroots within the educational institutions. And we study and we major now in gender studies. We study intersectionality, which is a practice, a lens that has been developed by Black feminists. And it's our duty, I think, to include these voices whenever we talk about integrated policies, because these experiences are a constant everyday fight against gender-based or intersectional oppression and discrimination. So all of this is to say that social movements need to be taken very seriously, because the experience that they bring and the knowledge that they bring is absolutely fundamental. And I think that it's one thing that it's particularly important to feature in when we talk about integrated policies for combating online gender-based violence is, for example, to take advantage of the manifold strategies that social movement enact every day already in this sector. And I can see at least 3 different strategies that, by all means, it's necessary to say, are carried on every single day in a total context of scarcity of resources. This is to say that every single day at the grassroots level, there is a constant struggle to overcome gender-based violence, that it's done with a total lack of means because it's mandatory to overcome these sort of injustices. So one type of strategies that are inactive are definitely reparative strategies. So whenever somebody is hit by gender-based violence, domestic violence, any sort of violence or injustice, social movement provide a whole network of services like counseling, sheltering, psychological assistance, and that is something that happens on the everyday. There are proactive strategies, which are highly skilled educational strategies that social movement enacts every day, and they do it with assemblies, book presentations, in all the forms that you can imagine, and on an everyday basis also online, by actually educating to also a language of inclusion and fairness, and to the language that we should use when we denounce the roots of this phenomenon, which is something that it's a true prerogative of social movements. So we do confront very much with the phenomenon for how of gender-based violence, for how it happens. We measure the numbers, we call for data, and we might also have very sophisticated means of analyzing that, but we rarely really, well, Dr. Allen just did it, but we really mention the causes behind this phenomenon. Racism, misogyny, sexism, ableism, ageism, all of this are names and concepts that are used in everyday language by feminist, transfeminist, and LGBTQAI movement. And this is educational because we must be educated in, and we should learn how to talk about all of this. And last, I would like to say that there are also contentious strategies. If a policy like the Digital Service Act is meant to produce more accountability, then social movements are those collective subjects that actually say, well, good, but not enough. We need to do more. We need to get our hands dirty, and we have to do it all together. So ultimately, what I think is that integrated policies should exist, but inclusion should not overlap with co-optation. Integrated policies can actually be done if they are thought and experimented as laboratories for democratic improvement and enhancement. And this means not considering any longer social movements only as enemies or a bunch of people that make a lot of noise, because if they do so much noise, and if they have been doing so much noise for all these decades, they really have good reasons to do that. So co-participation, co-organization, co-projection, for me, everything that it's common and mutuates the common logic that comes from social movements is something that integrated policies should strive for. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And getting our hands dirty is definitely something that I will remember for today. Maybe as a last question, I want to get back to the title of today, right? Manable, enabling manpower against gender-based violence online. Like, if we want to go towards this deconstructing of toxic masculinity, if we want to really shift things online, both trickle down, top down, bottom up grassroots movements, how, like, what is like one action that you would like to see from another stakeholder group represented on this panel in order to like actively combat GBV online? Whoever feels something coming, please start.
I can start, but I would say that, I mean, the question in itself of what one stakeholder could do opens up the other question of what do all stakeholders need to do, to be honest, right? So I wanted to go back to the actual title as well on kind of the integrated policies and the approach that we take, right? Because we've all mentioned patriarchy, we've all mentioned kind of the impact on women and girls and the gender dimension. But when we talk about patriarchy, we have to remember that it impacts all of us negatively. The Digital Services Act also, and again, you did a great job. It's a huge piece of legislation, and no one can explain it in less than 5 minutes. It's enormous. But it also includes mental well-being as a systemic risk. And if you look at the environment that many boys and teenage boys are experiencing in the online space right now, a lot of people have talked about the increase of the manosphere. There's some amazing reports that you should read about this and the psychological impact that this is having, and maybe even the contribution to gender equity coming to a standstill. In fact, the progress that we've been making over the years has started to come to a standstill, and where can those conversations go? I think then you need to look at it again in that holistic approach, right?
Yes.
So this is where it's super important. And I mentioned holistic, but I also want to mention the need for a nuanced approach. Because sometimes brute force isn't always the way to go. And I think gender-based violence online is one of those aspects. I think you need a very clear legal framework in terms of how you have to approach it. But I like the approach that's been taken in the European context, which is there are some things that need to be approached through due diligence. And this is the responsibility of the platforms. And I would be remiss if I didn't reiterate that, yes, the Digital Services Act encourages collaboration with civil society organizations but we will be holding the platforms to account to do that, because thus far it's been quite difficult for civil society to achieve this. But at the same time, we cannot criminalize all forms of online gender-based violence, and that is because we have to protect the free expression of the groups who are most likely impacted by this. So there are some forms that are very pertinent to do so, but that kind of dual approach is where I think we need to go. And that means understanding what's happening for all in, demographics in the online sphere and the online harms that they are experiencing. So this is that there's a need for all stakeholders, I guess. I think the EU it's great to see that it was high on the political agenda. When I arrived, there wasn't even a discussion. The discussion about the directive back in 2017 was just, it's not going to happen. And now we're here and we have a directive, right? Or even just the early discussions on the Digital Services Act. We don't need gender-based violence in there because it's, it'll make things very complicated. No, it's great. It's in there and it's fantastic that it is. So we can always make those steps forward, but there's a requirement for the online platforms that are governed by the Digital Services Act, which is all of them. But for the very large online platforms in particular that have those tiered additional obligations, that they must be held to account to adhering to those and don't have a race to the bottom for their accountability and their transparency, but actually take on the responsibility that they have not only under the Digital Services Act, but under the international human rights frameworks, under the UN guiding principles. They have multiple responsibilities for this and they must be held. The same thing comes for our co-legislators. It's been great to be able to work and develop these policies, but we need to make sure they are enforced from a human rights perspective. We, as civil society, as academics, as those experts in the field, must be more consistently and formally consulted in terms of how to make sure the enforcement is achieved in that way, and that there isn't overreach when it comes to enforcement, and that it doesn't disproportionately impact on others. And there needs to be space for academics and those to be able to come in and provide that expertise too. So it's, I would say that the one part of the question is it's for all stakeholders to be able to go to that integrated approach and think about how we're addressing those policies. And it always brings me back to a reflection that I had, which is that gender equality is not a women's issue, right? It's an all of us issue. So that's the kind of reflection I had on your specific question. I don't know who wants to go next.
I agree with Asha.
If I just may follow up on that, I think that one important question that I would like to ask to any other stakeholder that is involved in this is, whose stake are we talking about? Which means, are recognizing the subjectivity and the situatedness of the gaze from which we move into the field of gender-based violence or digital social justice more broadly. Because it is important that we understand that the stake that is at stake might not be our privilege, but it is a collective way of being all better together. And sometimes this means also taking a step back from what is our primary stake and putting someone else's stake higher in a priority list, and changing the way in which we act, not to so much care for ourselves as much as we care for the others. It's important to understand that as academics, most of the time, as politicians, most of the time, we do not act for ourselves, but also for subjectivities and for experiences that we don't know that much about. I cannot be sure 100%, but maybe none of us in this room has ever lived with a disability, or never experienced not having a house, or not having experienced not having enough money to eat. At that point, the range of injustices that we are actually tackling with a more gender-balanced approach are issues of social justice. And the social justice must start with recognition of our privilege when we sit in the places in which we can actually decide how a more fair and just environment it is going to look. And so the question that I would ask is, whose stakes are we trying to defend here? And maybe it's just a provocation, but I think it's an important provocation to keep in mind.
Thank you for the provocation, for sure. I've seen the 2-minute paper, so I am going to look towards you, Julie, if you have a last remark.
I think you guys nailed it. Yeah, honestly, plus 100 to what you all said. I think with the 20 seconds I have, one thing that I think is pertinent to say is that, well, we still have a very long way to go in making all these work. I think the DSA is an excellent step forward in terms of harmonizing and making it very clearly enforceable. I think the elections come at a really good time for the Parliament, the Council, and the Commission to take a breather, really focus on implementation, integrating everyone into this new system, getting trusted flaggers. The Commission is going to be a regulator for the first time. They're quite immature in the space. They need time to reach this new height. We need time to implement. So I would just say, let's really focus on European integration into every member state, and then take it forward with, a new, fresh Parliament and Commission, and see what are the gaps that leaves behind, right? And how legislation can help us fix those gaps from there.
Thank you so much. We are at the end of this panel, which means there's a coffee break. Sabrina,